our next speaker. This is our plenary speaker for session 1. This will be Alistair Hobday. Alistair Hobday is a senior principal research scientist with CSIRO Oceans and Atmosphere based in Hobart, Australia. And he is an adjunct professor at the Center for Marine Socioecology at the University of Tasmania. His research interests include spatial management, mitigation of large pelagic species, data-limited fisheries assessment methods, development of seasonal forecasting applications, applications of climate change, variability and extremes on marine resources, and development and testing of marine adaptation options for marine conservation and aquaculture. So he's a busy man. With that, he'll speak to us about ocean extremes and marine heat waves and marine ecosystems.
Thank you. What's it?
Yeah. What's that? It should be right. Yeah.
Beauty.
Yep.
Yep.
Can I bring it up?
Thank you. I'd particularly like to thank Roger and Jason for your efforts in putting this week together with the rest of your organising committee. All the sponsors that have organised this really great event, particularly Thomas and Gabrielle as organisers of the session that I'm speaking in today, which continues. That's the extreme session. And pretty much all of you as well for a pretty fantastic week of what I think have been really friendly events. Really friendly events. Beauty.
Next.
Please switch to full screen. Thank you. My co-authors for the talk that I'm presenting to you, a guy called Eric Oliver, who's just moved to Dalhousie University, Neil Holbrook, who works at the University of Tasmania, Dan Smale from the UK, and Thomas Wernberg from Western Australia. And together with about 15 or so other people, we've kind of got a loose affiliation. We call this Marine Heat Waves Working Group. And my goal today is to describe to you some of the cutting-edge work that we think is happening in the marine extreme space under the guise of heat waves, and try and convince you that these kind of extremes are a really important part of the conversation about climate change, and they can be particularly useful for us in thinking about conversations with the general public. This is the Vostok ice core. And you drill down through this core and extract out small bubbles which can tell you things like past climate, in particular temperature and CO2 levels. And this is a typical way of looking at this plot, which you can see that the climate system has oscillated in the past. I prefer to look at it when they're plotted one against each other. And the two axes there now are temperature and CO2, and that shows you the space that our climate system has oscillated in for what we now know is the last 800,000 years. So that's been a pretty stable environment, and in fact we're living through extremes right now. So we're up at 405 parts per million at the moment of CO2 and the temperature, and we're well outside the coping range for the planet. So while I'm talking about extremes as if they were something new today, I think we're living through a really extreme period now. Because of this continued change, the future is going to be really different. And so even all of the experience we've gathered over the past 40 or 50 years of scientific research on the ocean, I think that experience is becoming less valuable for the future because we're seeing novel combinations of physics and biology and chemistry, and that's really impacting our ability to give advice to the people who need to do their management or businesses in the ocean. And so that's left us as a science community kind of having to give the best that we can at the moment and kind of hope those decisions are going to be able to be adjusted in future as we learn more. But that really makes it important for us, you know, a theme I started with on Monday, that we need to learn as fast as we can. So how do you learn faster in a system that's changing rapidly? We really learn faster when we can understand cause and effect. And we go about that work as scientists in three main ways. We use models, and if we have process and mechanism, which is sometimes limited and difficult to get, we can get system understanding from use of models. We use experiments. But the trouble with experiments is the number of factors that you can include and the scale at which you do them can be quite limited. And then the third aspect that we use to understand systems is by observations. We do local studies, and they give us in situ process understanding. We can do spatial contrasts and use the space for time analogy. And finally, we can use temporal contrasts. And the extremes I'm going to talk about today are an example of using a temporal contrast. Let's make use of opportunity in the system to learn fast. So here's an example of learning fast with spatial contrasts. Work with Greta Peckel and others have identified really fast warming areas around the world. And so we exploited those spatial patterns to learn very quickly. And so again, with about 6 Southern Hemisphere countries, we've had a look at trying to compare what's going on in those rapidly warming areas and see if we can then learn very quickly about how people and communities are adapting. The second way then of using observations to learn fast is with temporal contrasts. And we've known about temporal variability for a long time. Here's an example from an ENSO field of research, and you can see there are peaks and troughs in that time series. And those extremes represent a chance for us to learn very quickly. And those peaks and troughs in any particular time series or sequence of events are known as extreme events. We get those at the moment under climate change because the distribution of events is shifting. And in this case, it's temperature in the probability distribution function. And as mean temperatures rise, so too does the distribution of extremes. And so we're getting more extremes on the right-hand end, for example, hot events. But it could be cyclones or hurricanes or storm surges, tsunamis, deoxygenation events, which we've heard about at this meeting, could be considered a type of extreme, as might be upwelling that gives you pH changes very rapidly in the ocean. And I'll spend most time on marine heat waves now. And extreme events have real value to us in our conversation about climate change with the community because they're notable events and they produce sometimes very shocking images or experiences or impacts on human society and natural ecosystems. And so I think, I don't use that insensitively, but we need to exploit the opportunity that extremes give us for continuing to have a conversation with society about what climate change is doing to the ocean. And around about 2011, when I became interested in extremes, we understood that there were these really hot and dramatic events, and there was plenty of evidence that things like heat waves had an impact on land. And the most dramatic one of those was the 2003 European heat wave, which this group needs no reminding of the kind of impacts that had on many, many countries through Europe. But equivalent ocean events weren't being identified in the same way. As I put this talk together, it made me curious because over my career I've always understood El Nino events and I've worked on those and with many of you in the audience also focusing on ENSOs, but we didn't really identify them in the same way as I think the heat wave community was doing with terrestrial events. But we had certainly seen them. And the three classic events that I think were known up until about 2011 were the Mediterranean heat wave, which was associated with atmospheric warming over the European basin, one in Western Australia that happened in 2011, and then I think the Northwest Atlantic heat wave of 2012. And those kind of events happened and quickly enough together that it made a group of us start thinking more seriously about what we could do to learn about these extremes. And our session that we've been having this week and will continue today has gone through a range of these impacts of heat waves. Animals change distribution, populations drop, habitats are dramatically modified, blue carbon stocks were lost, as we just heard about in the previous session. And so the evidence is just accumulating that these extremes are really, really dramatic. Then we had the Northeast Pacific event of 2014, and I think that took our understanding of heat wave events to a new level. It wasn't really very well characterised at the time. It was being called a warm pool or a warm water anomaly, and I know that the North American community became very confused about what is this thing. And so I'm going to tell you a true story about a quest that you sent one person on to discover what was this particular thing going on. And this person then volunteered to go into the wilderness, and they were not going to come back until they had the answer of what it was. So he wandered around in the wilderness for a while trying different things, and he called back to the NOAA headquarters. Is it the blot? No, that wasn't what it was. Is it the blog? No, that didn't seem right either. The glob? He's walking around and trying these things in his head, and what will he come back to civilization with? Is it the Nickinator? I'll be back. And then settled on the blob. And as a piece of public communication and outreach and just general cut-through, I think the blob has been really effective as a communication device. And we've definitely heard a lot about it at this particular meeting. It had impacts in the middle panel there, all the way up the food chain, from whales at the top and dolphins all the way back down the food chain through to phytoplankton and zooplankton. The impacts on human economy were incredible, with the figure on the right showing where paralytic shellfish poisoning and DOM outbreaks led to closures of particular fisheries, with the different symbols indicating where fisheries closures were impacted. But given that, it is just a marine heat wave. And while you've created this great story around the blob, how's this community going to get ready to do when it comes back the next time? Are you going to call it the blob returns? The son of blob, blob 3? What about when climate change is going? You're up to blob 27? It's hard to think of that as being a very good communication device, particularly because marine heat waves occur everywhere in the world, not just in the Northeast Pacific, and so other places are going to want their blob. So it's going to become very difficult for us as a community to talk about, now which blob was that? Did you mean the blob back then or the blob over there? So at the same time as Nick was wandering in the wilderness, thinking about what to call this event, a group of us were also thinking about it in the Southern Hemisphere. And we got together in Western Australia in 2014 with a group from across a range of countries in the Southern Hemisphere. And since then have had a series of workshops. And we've just had our third one last year, and it's through the efforts of that working group that we've kind of sketched out a plan. You know, there's our whiteboard picture for how we're going to tack and work through this particular problem of heat waves. And I'll just lead you through some of those examples now, just to show where I think some of the really exciting breakthroughs have been on marine heat waves. The first thing was actually to define a marine heat wave. We didn't have a clear definition of what one was. And so qualitatively, it's just a discrete, prolonged, anomalous patch of warm water at a particular location. They can be surface or subsurface, and so a qualitative definition just has to be rich enough to encompass the range of events that we see. And then we turned into a quantitative definition. So, to be anomalously warm, you have to lie above a certain percentile threshold. And we took a lot of lessons from the atmospheric community that defines an atmospheric heat wave as any temperatures above the 90th percentile that persist for 3 days or more. And we did a bunch of sensitivity analysis with how long the period has to be in the ocean. And for us, it seemed like 5 days was about the right period of time. And it's a continuous process. So in a sense, we've just picked a number, and sensitivity testing shows that it's about right. So it's anomalously warm, it's prolonged, and it's discrete. It has clear start and end dates. And when you've done that, you can actually define an event. And so in the top left there with the blue histogram, that shows the distribution of temperature in a particular region. And if I just pick a threshold, which is the 90% line there, we could actually then start to define events that were above 90% and persisted for 3 days or more. And then out of that, in the bigger picture there, you see with the red line is an example marine heat wave. If it just goes up and down quickly, it's just a spike. It doesn't get to be counted as a marine heat wave. If it persists for a bit longer, you can create a bunch of metrics that describe that shape. Its duration, its height, how fast it ramps up, how fast it ramps down, and various statistics about the cumulative impact of it. And in that sense, it's quite similar to the degree weeks concept that's been used in coral bleaching for quite some time. With those kind of metrics, you can then distinguish different styles of marine heat waves. Fat ones, short ones, skinny ones, ones that ramp up quickly, ones that ramp down, and so on. And so you create a vocabulary around marine heat waves that lets you, I think, then begin to do the quantitative analysis. And with that, you're then able to do a range of things. You can do comparisons, you can do detailed descriptions, develop an understanding of the flavours of marine heat waves, just as we have flavours of ENSO. We've worked through attribution, trends, projections, and so on, and I'll show you that now. So the first thing it let us do was a really easy comparison of heat waves across regions. And so there are the 3 big events that I mentioned before, the Western Australian, the Mediterranean, and the Northwest Atlantic. And you can gather statistics, and you'll see that for those particular areas, those bar plots just show different versions of those metrics through time. And so there are high bars and low bars through time, but the events are not unique. We just haven't always noticed them because sometimes they're just not big enough. You can then do detailed descriptions, and here's an analysis that we did for the east coast of Tasmania based on an ocean model, dividing up the ocean into a bunch of boxes, and we identified about 400 events over that period of time that could be classified as marine heat waves. And that's pretty similar to the amount of events that actually we have as terrestrial heat waves in that period of time. So the measure's sensitive enough that we have interesting things to say about it. And we developed an atlas that would help stakeholders in our region understand that if they experienced this type of event, what was associated with it. So those panels are the average sea temperature, current direction, air temperature and sea level pressure that you might expect to see during one of those events, and then the statistics for any individual event there. And we're now asking those stakeholders to look back through their aquaculture records or the fishery records and see if there were things that were going on that they had not been able to explain previously. And that's giving us a richness of biological impacts that now we can begin to move to, say, meta-analysis of what those impacts were. And through that, we also identified that there are different flavours of marine heat wave. And the plot on the right-hand side just shows that there are 12 different flavours we identified. They're all significantly different except for two, and they're influenced by how much advection, in this case the vertical axis, is influencing the strength of a marine heat wave and how much the atmosphere reinforces it. And so the one on the top right is a heat wave where both the transport into our region is very strong and the heat from the atmosphere is very strong, giving you a very, very strong signal. And then you can create statistics out of that and do whatever you like with the numbers. There are clear trends in those flavours as well, and these are the same 12 examples here. Everywhere you see red, that's where that type of flavour is significantly increasing in frequency. And so again, in the top right, those heat waves that are influenced by the ocean and the atmosphere most strongly are increasing significantly in frequency in that area. Just gets you though, if we've got all these types of them and the blob's not doing the trick, what are we going to do with a name? And cyclones and hurricanes have had a system that's worked reasonably effective for quite a while. Cyclone Tracy, Hurricane Katrina and so on, and they have some cut through, but they don't tell you particularly where the event was. If you didn't know where Cyclone Tracy was, a really significant Australian cyclone, we can't begin to have a conversation about it. Bushfires in Australia are even worse. We can only afford 2 more major bushfires before we've run out of distinguishing events. Look out Thursday. So it's really important to have good naming conventions. At this conference, for example, we've had 26 presentations in the extremes session, and people used heat waves as one word in 5 of those abstracts, heat wave as 2 words in another one, hyphenated heat waves in a third one there. And it's really important that we get that consistent and we have one description so that we can search them, compare them and so on. If you're working on bushfires, would it be bushfire or bushfire? I did the Google search. It's bushfire, one word. If you're working on earthquakes, is it earthquake or earthquake? 100% of people who work on earthquakes think they're earthquakes. Climate change or climate change? Which one do you work on? 99% of us work on climate change. And then what do you think of when you go with marine heat wave or heat wave? What do you reckon it should be? We're all over the place. This is 450 records of heat wave that I could get in Google Scholar when I was up late, and it's a 50-50. But over time, heat wave is winning. Please, go with one word. Another challenge for us in using extremes was that for a while, they weren't particularly linked to climate change. And so a journalist would come to people working on climate and say, we just had a really big flood. Was that part of climate change or not? And scientists would pretty much say this, and I know that many of us have said it before, no individual event is really caused by climate change. However, this is the type of thing we expect to hear more frequently in future. And the response to that is, thank you, that was very helpful. But since about 2004, we've been able to do attribution of extreme events, and it started with UK research around the European heat wave and then a flooding event that followed that. And so now we can actually attribute and make those statements, was this event, in a sense, due to climate change? And that's good news. We can blame natural disasters on climate change as well. That will have some implications in the future for legal responsibility around climate change, I feel, but that's another story. For example, the Tasman Sea marine heat wave of 2015-16, remember where it was and how big it was? That lasted for 252 days, and an event that long was 330 times more likely because of greenhouse gas and global climate change. Its intensity was 6.8 times more likely because of climate change. And we can go on and do that for other major events, like the Northern Australia mangrove event that was just mentioned in the last presentation. That one was 8.5 times more likely as a result of climate change. The Bering Sea marine heat wave, of 2016. That was 7.3 times more likely as a result of climate change. So those statements now give us much better information for communicating to people about them. We've seen great trends in marine heat waves as well. This plot shows over the period of the satellite record an increasing frequency of marine heat waves, even after you remove the effect of things like ENSO events. And if you take that back into the reconstructed history, marine heat waves have become 34% more frequent, 17% longer, and the total number of days that a region is experiencing a heat wave has increased by 54%. The problem is, if we're getting more heat waves, pretty soon every day is going to be a marine heat wave. This is some recent work out of our group that shows, using 2 different RCP scenarios, that we begin to saturate our metric by about mid to late century. So what will that mean when every day is a marine heat wave day? Well, the options are we could change the definition, pretend, and others are doing that, thinking about 99% is the new definition of a heat wave, but that's not a fix, because you're still going to exit that distribution very quickly. We could change the baseline and redefine heat waves every decade. I don't think that's a particular fix, and so we've decided we can create a category system. And for designing a category system, you want it to be something that you can update as a heat wave progresses. It should reflect the local thermal impact. It should be possible to change as the event strengthens or weakens in time, and it shouldn't be too complicated. And so an example of what we do that is for cyclones or hurricanes. And there's a hurricane track, and we know that we listened to those events and it was Category 2, then it upgraded to Category 3, Category 4, relax everyone, it's back down to Category 2. And so our scheme we propose for marine heat waves is exactly the same. It's instantaneous, it's based on the intensity of that heat wave that you're experiencing at the time, and it's just multiples of the basic definition that increase there. So we could define up to a Category 1, 2, 3, 4 marine heat wave. In the future, we might need to have higher heat wave frequencies than that. And so for the Tasman Sea event that I talked about, you can see then on that colour graph there how it's entered those different categories as the event has progressed. And you can also understand the different amounts of time that it's had different intensities, and that becomes very useful for doing biological studies as well, because you now know something more about the strength. I could show you the same for the Northeast Pacific heat wave, also known as the blob, the Northwest Atlantic. And imagine that you're working at GMRI and you're sitting in your office and the media keeps calling you. You can talk to them every week and give them updates on how this marine heat wave is progressing, because we can analyse them in real time and report on how those events are progressing. The strongest one by our scheme at the moment has been the Western Australian 2011 heat wave, which went into the extreme category. And these categories have also increased in frequency, in strength over time, and we've seen a 24% increase in what we call Category 2 marine heat waves. And I just contrast the 1982 ocean during El Nino with the 2016 ocean of with an El Nino. And again, the hottest colours are the extreme events, and much more of the ocean was classified as undergoing an extreme heat wave. And this system seems like it'll work. And so here are projections of marine heat wave categories towards the end of this century under 2 RCPs. And you can see that we're getting an increasing frequency of those most extreme events. Under the most extreme RCP, in fact, it's the extreme heat waves that begin to dominate. So we're going to need a bigger category. I'll just say that then this communicating of extremes is really important. And so the things that society knows best are things that have formal names and have a category scale, and those things are up in the left. But there are all these other extremes, and our ocean events tend to be down in the bottom right. We don't have a scale and we don't have names for them. So we really have a communication problem around things like acidification events, deoxygenation events and marine heat waves. And so this example I've used for you with you for marine heat waves puts marine heat waves up in that same category as, say, cyclones or other things that are really well understood by society. And so as you go to work on these events, our hope is that you'll use something like the area and the peak year for strong marine heat waves that are above Category 2. You don't need to name every one, they're not all particularly relevant, but just look at the big ones, such as the Tasman Sea 2015 marine heat wave. So the next steps in marine heat waves then, I think where this field's still to go, is get into more prediction now. We can do real-time description, but can we tell people ahead of time that we're entering these marine heat waves? Now we have a framework that will let us understand the biological impact. How is intensity, duration, and those other things related to impact? And now that, go back and let's do more and more of those regional studies and really get a good handle on what these events do. If you like that idea and you're interested in working on marine heat waves, the code to make any of those figures is freely available as either an R or a Python package, and that's just available from the website marineheatwaves.org. You could also apply the same framework to cold events, which some folk from South Africa have done to define these cold anomalies that are still present in upwelling areas. Maybe we could do it for acidification or deoxygenation, but you can manipulate the code and do as you like. I hope I've argued to you that extremes really do represent a chance for fast learning. In the words of Cisco Werner, they're a stress test. They're a stress test on the biology, they're a stress test on the people who are in those regions, and they're a stress test on the managers who are responsible for them. If you do a comparative marine heat wave approach with constant description, I think you'll make faster breakthrough. And I differ a little bit from Steve Whittacombe yesterday, who said, go out and be messy in your world and let's see what you can learn. In this case, I'm arguing, let's be a bit more consistent, and I think we can learn even more quickly in this case. We need lots of continued research to address the relationship with impacts, and I definitely think that prediction's the next frontier, and we'll be seasonally forecasting these events the next time that we meet. Thank you.
Thank you for an interesting talk. We do have some time for questions. Please come to the microphones if you have a question.
Great talk, Alistair. Sorry, got there first. How relevant are short-term forecasts for this? I mean, for example, we operate a 10-day European seas forecast. Would analysing that in terms of heat wave be relevant to stakeholders? Do you have an appreciation of that?
Yeah, I think that absolutely there are stakeholders who need to know about extreme temperatures on that very short time scale. And an example would be an aquaculture business that's just experiencing heat stress. Can they ride it out, or do they need to pull those fish, oysters, whatever it is, out of the water and harvest them tomorrow or the next day? Or can they hang on because the heat wave's dropping off? So I think there's a role for those whole time scale of forecasts.
Thank you.
Looks like you have a cue here.
In the engineering world, the concept of return periods is quite common. So they say if you build a nuclear power station, it has to be able to withstand a 1 in 10,000 year event.
Yeah.
Have you thought about calculating return periods?
We have calculated return periods, but they're pretty unsatisfactory because of the speed at which the climate envelope is changing. And so what does it mean to tell someone it was a 1 in 300 year event when in fact you get one the next year and the next year? So I think our ability to really understand what's that return period in a rapidly changing climate is very hard. So I don't think it's going to have a great utility in this case. Yeah.
So Alistair, very nicely put together. I think the idea of the 5 categories works very well from a communication perspective. And from a human perspective, changing to a changing climatology makes sense, but we're leaving a lot of organisms in the dust or burning up or boiling. So what do we do if we're going to have something where the categories are changing as the climatology changes through time, to think about the organisms that don't change that rapidly?
I'm definitely not advocating let's get there. I hope that this is one more example of how we will enter a very changed world unless we do some serious adaptation and mitigation. I think that living in that world will be very uncomfortable, and I think pointing out you'll be in a Category 5 world to people today might be, again, just one of those things that adds to the call for action. Thanks, Mark.
We have a question here.
Kathy in the corner.
All right, well, I think it sort of follows on that question. I guess I really appreciated, thank you for the talk. I really appreciate your efforts to think about how we systematize, how we talk about heat waves, and particularly the value of that for doing comparative studies. So going back to the issue of not changing your baseline, it seems that when you get into trying to study ecological change as a result of these heat waves, that the ecosystem will be integrating the trend over time, as well as then these events overlaid on the trend. And I'm just wondering if your group has thought about how to sort of capture the impact of isolated events and then over time, those isolated events on a changed ecosystem.
Yes, if we thought that adaptation of biological and human system was going to keep up, then we would keep resetting the baseline, and we would use this as a description of true extremes. At the moment, we think that, well, we don't know enough to make that translation, but I'm not really convinced this will be here in 50 years. Someone will have thought of something better. So at the moment, I think it works best to keep the baseline constant and use it as a communication device about what that changed world will be. Definitely, I think there will be some adaptation of species, and whether they keep up with category 1, 2, 3 or 4, I don't have a sense of.
Hi, thanks. That was a great talk. Appreciated it. I have a comment and then a question. The comment is that, at least in the US, we do have a scale for hail. We have 2 levels. We have golf ball size and we have softball size. So I don't know how useful that is elsewhere, but we do have that anyway. But my question really is, so what's the basis for saying that an event is 6.8 more times likely because of climate change than before?
If you take a historical distribution of temperatures in an area, you can say that, well, what we saw was a temperature that was out on the end of that distribution. And then you run a set of climate models with and without greenhouse gas emissions, and you see, did you ever encounter an event like that? And so by looking at the differences in the probability distributions, you can start to say that was so unlikely, unless we had greenhouse gases, that it was 6, 10 or 300 times difference.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Beauty. Hey, thanks everyone. I know everyone heads home today as well, and that you've met a lot of great people, and for me in particular, I know it's always hard saying goodbye. We bust off to the airport, so thanks everyone who I don't say goodbye to. Thank you.